All right, so it's 11:40, so let's start. I know there's the session that was missed yesterday is going to be next up in the lunch slot, so the timing is of importance here. So let's get started. Welcome to this session about moving your development environment to the cloud with the GitHub Codespaces. So my name is Jakob Ehn. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP. I work for a company called Active Solution back in Stockholm, Sweden, where we're doing a lot of Azure cloud container development. I also have a strong interest around DevOps. I've been working in that space for many years, helping our clients, trying to be more effective, more automation and so on. So this topic today is actually very, very interesting for me, and it's a problem that I've been battling with for many years. And it's kind of this problem. And I think most of you are developers, and I'm sure that you have been experiencing this. And in particular, if you're a consultant or if you switch projects from time to time, it's always the same thing, right? You want to kind of download the project, compile it, and get it running. How many times did that work for the first time? Like never. So is there a README file? Sometimes there is a README file. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's usually a bad thing because the README file is incorrect, so it doesn't really contain the right instructions for me to get started. Because you have to know where is the code, how do I build it, what do I need on my local machine to actually run it. So it's usually like this: you spend 3 days and you can't really explain what you were doing. And once, when you actually have everything up and running, you still have kind of this problem, like you got it running, but it won't be running on any other machine that you have or that your colleague have, because you're not quite sure what you actually did. Maybe you skipped one instruction in that README file that didn't apply to you. So this is a problem that I'm experiencing for like 20 years in consulting. Every time I come to a new project, it's always this problem. So setting up the developer workstation, the time for you to actually make your first commit, to actually be productive, that time is generally too long. So if you just want to make a short fix, you spend like 95% of the time setting up the environment, getting everything up and running, making sure they have the right code, the right versions of everything, and then finally you can actually do something productive. And again, the works in my box problem, we talk about that for running things in production, but it's the same thing here. How can you fix a bug if you have your development environment is very different from your staging and production environment? That doesn't make sense. They should be as identical as possible, right? Always, also, like the last point there, the hardware spec kind of seems to be increasing all the time. In general, all developers are kind of sighing about like, it takes too much time to build this thing. Even though like our computer is getting more and more powerful, it seems like we always want more and more for some reason. So I think these things are kind of pushing each other. So, DevOps in general doesn't really address this problem, right? We talk a lot about things that happens after you commit your code. So we talk about CI/CD, we talk about automated testing, we talk about deployment, all of those things, which of course is very important. But kind of this local setup, the inner loop of development, it's not really talked about that much, not really prioritized. So when we talk about development environment, I mean, what is that? What's actually part of a development environment? Well, first up, it's like, there's some kind of IDE, somewhere where you actually write your code. So it could be like VS Code, Visual Studio, Vim, any text editor of your choice. And then there's code, right? You have to have some code to actually develop anything. Then we have all these other things that you want to typically have. You typically must have some of the tools that actually be needed to build and run the application. Could be like the SDKs. It could be extensions to your IDE. So VS Code has a lot of extensions that you typically want to use. Some of them makes a lot of sense for some projects, maybe not for other projects. So it's kind of, some extensions are always applicable, some extensions are more related to that particular project. But these are also things that you need to install if you don't have it. Then we have the always occurring problem of dependencies, right? Your application very rarely can run by itself. You need to have the necessary dependencies. So, the correct version of the .NET Core SDK, for example, or any other dependencies, you have to make sure that you have that installed on your local machine. Otherwise, it won't compile. So it doesn't compile. You check the README. It doesn't say anything, or it's incorrect. And, You just hammer around and eventually it will work. You want to be able to debug your application, of course, typically inside your IDE. You want a terminal so you can run commands and all those kind of things. And then you have all, like these settings, your team settings, the personal settings, things like, what theme do I want to use, like what color do I want to have in my IDE and so on. These are things that you don't want to give up, right? But you spend a lot of time making sure that they are correct. Every time you get a new box, you typically spend a lot of time getting everything back to the state that they actually were again. And this is what this GitHub Codespace is trying to solve. So the goal here is really we talk about infrastructure as code, right? We heard about that. So creating the infrastructure for your applications as code. But the goal here is really to think of your development environment as code. So you'll describe your environment as code, check that in, and that way we can make sure that everybody that's working in this repository will have the same setup. That's a great goal. So if you put everything in version control, so not just the code, but also like the description of what tools do I need, extension settings, any setup scripts, dependencies, you have that in version control. It will be cloned together with the code. Now it's also versioned, which means that if you, for example, you're working in this new feature branch where you're adding things, but then perhaps you need to go and fix a bug in an older branch, things might have changed, dependencies might have changed. That's always a hassle to kind of go back and forth in time, or switch work in repositories. If you have all this versioned, then it's going to work the next time you pick it up. I'm sure you experienced like a project that you worked on and everything works fine. Then you give it a rest for a couple of months and then go back to it and it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't compile, it doesn't run. And that's typically because not everything is versioned, so things change over time. But if you put in a source control, then it will be the same the next time. So really the goal is to allow developers to be more productive and quickly be more productive. Spend less time setting these things up over and over again. And optionally, it also opens up the possibility to actually kind of, instead of using the resources of your local machine, actually maybe you can use some other more powerful machine, typically in the cloud somewhere. So when you need to do some work that maybe requires more resources, why not use somebody else's machine that potentially is more powerful, right? So this opens up. It's not a requirement, but it kind of opens up this possibility. So GitHub Codespaces. How many are using GitHub for their daily work? It's not that many. I was kind of expecting that. So the good thing is that a lot of things that I talk about in this session will actually be very valuable for you, and you can use it without having the things in GitHub. But GitHub Codespace obviously is a service in GitHub that requires the code to be there. So, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. But GitHub Codespaces was actually first branded as Visual Studio Codespaces. Did anyone use that? No? So they actually started developing it kind of before the merge or the acquisition of GitHub. And they called it Visual Studio Codespace. But then when the merger was complete, they kind of rebranded everything and moved it to GitHub instead. So it's blazing fast cloud developer environments. And so you see the tagline there, Visual Studio Code, backed by high-performance virtual machines that starts in seconds. So this is very connected to VS Code. And as you see, you'll be able to use VS Code on your machine, but you can also use VS Code in the browser. So you don't have to install anything on your machine if you don't want to. So GitHub Codespaces is managed environments. The machines are managed by GitHub. They are running in Azure, in a selected Azure data center. So you don't need to manage them at all. You don't set them up. You just pay for the amount of time that you're using it. And again, you can develop from anywhere. You can, as I said, you can code in the browser. And actually a very, very similar experience to working on VS Code on your local machine. There's multiple available machine sizes, so you can select from, I think it's 2 cores up to 32 cores. So again, depending on your need, if you want to do something really fast, then you can select a very powerful machine. Of course, it will cost you more. But again, that might actually be worth that cost. And it's customizable. So the idea is not to have like one single type of development environment that fits all. That's kind of the opposite idea here. Everything should be customizable. So you can customize it for your team, your application, but also like your personal settings should be flowing along here. And as I said, you pay as you go. You pay for these machines for the amount of time they are up and running. And this is part of a GitHub team or enterprise licensing level. But you can also request it for if you have a GitHub personal account to try it out there. And that's what I'm using for this session. So again, to the left here on this slide, you have like you can work on VS Code desktop or VS Code browser. Either way, you'll be talking to the GitHub, to the virtual machines running in Azure. And these machines then will run a container, a Docker container. And inside that container, that's where your code will be stored. That's where you will be building your code. That's where you'll be running and testing your code as well. You don't really need to care about this. This is being set up for you. But the interesting thing now is that kind of this thing like that I put in the box here, all of that is actually built on top of something that has been available in Visual Studio Code for quite some time now. And this is called Visual Studio Code Remote Development. Has anyone used it here? Yeah? So these are extensions to VS Code that lets you use a remote development environment but still use VS Code. And GitHub Codespaces builds on top of this. So they will provide everything around it, like spinning up the machines, selecting machine sizes, and so on, and a few things more. But the cool thing is this thing is what you can actually use locally and get a lot of the advantages that I'm talking about. So by using VS Code remote development, you can use a container, a remote machine, or Windows subsystem for Linux as your full-featured development environment. And it looks like this. This is just taken from the documentation. So on your local machine, you have VS Code. And the themes and UI extensions will be running in VS Code on your OS, but everything else will be running inside this remote development. It could be a container or it could be a virtual machine, depending on what you select there. But let's just go with the container scenario. Again, everything that you do when you run commands, build code, test code, run code, will now run inside that container. So if you select the remote container extension, it will look like this typically, that's your source code. You can clone that on your local machine, and you will then mount that into the container. And again, this now opens up for this kind of isolated development environment that is not dependent on what you have on your machine. The only thing you have now on your machine really is VS Code and Docker, right? And you can actually use other things in Docker as well, as long as it's kind of Docker compliant. But let's stick to Docker for now. And that really kind of is one of the major purposes here, to not be dependent on what you have on your machine, because now all of your dependencies, the tools you need, the extensions you need, is now defined and running inside that container. And of course, now you can switch development environment. So if you switch project, you will switch to another of these remote development environments. And then, of course, the extensions and tools will change as well. So even now it's called remote containers. You will still often run this locally because you get a lot of benefit by doing so. But you could potentially run it on a remote machine. And of course, that is what GitHub Codespaces do as well. So let's just take a break from the slides, and I want to show you how this actually works. So we're going to start like this kind of local thing with the remote developers, and I'm going to show you GitHub Codespaces in a while. So I'm running VS Code, and I've installed the extension which is called VS Code Remote Development Containers. And so I get this little remote explorer over here, and I don't have really anything running right now. So it will list any containers that I have running, any volumes where my code will be and so on, but it's empty now. So for a quick start in VS Code, if you want to try this, you can select the remote containers, try a development container sample. So this is just, quickly try this out. So I recommend that you would do that by starting. So when I do that, you can select what type of language do you want to try out here. So I'm going to select the .NET Core. And all of this code is, of course, available over at GitHub, so you can check it out. And so when I open this now, you can see that there's a little notification down here that says starting dev container. And I can actually show you the logs here. So now a lot of kind of magic happens. So if you're not familiar with Docker, hopefully you don't need to look into this one, because it just does some Docker magic. But basically, it's going to start up a container that has the correct things. It's going to clone the code inside the container, and it's going to connect VS Code to it. And so what you'll see a little bit different if you use the VS Code is down to the lower left here. We have this little green thing now. And it says dev container C# sample. And this means now that VS Code is actually connected to a remote environment. In this case, a container running on my machine. So everything really except for that one looks the same. I have the code here. So I can do anything with the code. I can edit it. And you will get IntelliSense, of course. Everything works the same. We can see that the Git integration works as well. So I can commit things. But this code is actually not, well, the code is on my machine. But for example, when I build the code, it's not actually building on the host here. It's actually building inside the container. But you can't really tell the difference, right? But if I open a terminal now, so I'm on a Windows machine, but you can see like the path here is actually, it's a Linux path. So this path is now inside of containers. So any command that I run here is now executed inside of that container. So I can still see everything here. I can run, for example, .NET build. So, and it builds, nothing super interesting. If I, for example, do a .NET list SDKs, see what do I have here? It says I have only one version of .NET running here, or the SDKs, 3.1.416, because that's part now of this development environment. And just to kind of show you if I would run the same thing here, list SDKs, and type it correctly, you can see on my host I have all these other versions, and I don't actually even have the exact same version. So now you can see, like, for this particular project, I need to have that particular version. That's all I need. I don't need the other things, right? And it's not dependent now what I have on my machine. And so let's run the application to see what happens. So this is a super simple web application. So I run it. I get this little notification down here that says your application is running on port 5000. Do you want to open it in the browser? Sure. And I get the output. So you can see that even though it's running inside a container, I can very easily now actually run the application. I can debug the application, and I can access it from the outside, like from my host on that particular port. And so, just for interest, and let's see what's running in terms of Docker here. So if you haven't used Docker, this is not a session where you like explain Docker. But either way, you can see now that there is one container running, and that's actually now my container environment. So this was spun up for me, and this is where everything is happening now. So let's see. Actually, let's go check one more thing. That was kind of perhaps some magic there. When I ran the application, you can see that it popped up and say it's listening on port 5000. So this is one of the smart things that it does, that when you run your application, and if it outputs like this, anything related to like listening to a local host or something like that string will actually be picked up and notified to you, and that port will automatically be forwarded. And if I go to the ports tab here, I can see now that I have port 5000, which is what the application listens to in the container, is now being forwarded to the host. And that was actually done automatically. But of course, I could configure that. I can select which port I want to expose. And as you'll see later on, this will actually work even if you're running in the cloud in GitHub Codespaces, because they will also do port forwarding for you. But then it won't be localhost, of course. It will be through a external available URL. So that was just the first quick demo. So, to just try it out. So what actually happened, now it cloned that code. It put it somewhere on your machine. You don't really even you need to know where it put that code. You use the container for your development. You can check in the code. And when you're done, you can close everything. And your development environment, your host machine is still clean and nice. So that was like the default experience. And I didn't do any customizations or anything. So it just used the default image for that particular code that I selected. So in that case, it already contained the things that I needed and kind of default settings. But of course, that won't always be enough. You want to be able to customize your environment. So you do that by configuring and modifying a file called a devcontainer.json. So this is a file that, if it's in your repository, it will be picked up by these extensions. And when you open that environment, it will process it. And typically, you can also have a Docker file there that contains anything that you want to have installed in your environment. For example, the corresponding version of the .NET SDK or anything else. And this file can look like this. So this is a short example. So let's just mention a few of these things I talk about here. So the first one is, again, the reference to a Docker file. So this is basically your virtual machine, your development environment, the things you need to build and run your application. Now, this could also point to an existing Docker image, which makes sense in a lot of cases. So you can pre-build it, so you don't have to build it all the time. I'll come back to that. Next up is the extensions, and I will show you that in a minute. So again, extensions in VS Code, there's like a million of them, and some of them are really, really useful. And they're often, as I mentioned, also related to what project you're working on, right? If you're using a project that gets deployed to Azure, you typically have some Azure extensions. But if you're working on another project that is not related to Azure, then why would you need Azure extensions in VS Code, right? So it makes a lot of sense to put this here, because that means that any developer that opens up this environment will get these extensions installed automatically. That is then appropriate for that particular project. We have the forward ports. As you saw, it can often do a little bit of magic and just find out which port your application listens to and expose them. But you can also forward ports kind of manually by editing this file like this. And of course, that the reason will be now you can access it from your host machine. We have like these life cycle commands. Maybe the most common one is the post create. If you want to run something after the environment is created, for example, maybe you want to do a .NET restore. The first time you open it up, you can do that. So there's multiple of these commands, like pre and post create and so on. So you can kind of customize what's happening when you create and open this environment. So these are a few of the most common things that you'll modify in the dev container JSON. And so there's a kind of a workflow here, especially now that if you start playing with this, you typically want to edit this file. So it's kind of a little bit of a meta catch-22 thing here. You're opening up your environment, which is based on the dev container JSON file, and then you edit that file. So what happens then, right? Then you have to actually rebuild that environment. So there's a little bit of workflow here. So once this environment is kind of stable, you typically won't touch that file much going forward. But when you start up a new project and you want to kind of create this environment, then you typically have this loop where you open it up, you create the file for the first time, and then you run the environment, then you make changes to it, and then you will rebuild that container and reopen it. So I will show you how that actually works in another demo. So in this case, let's close this remote connection. And let's go back here. And let's just create a new application. Let's see, where am I? Let's go here. Let's do a .NET new MVC. Let's call it NDC demo. And open it up in VS Code. Source, NDC demo. Okay. All right, so this is, of course, just me on my host writing code as usual. But let's now add this dev container file. So again, you can use the command palette. You can just search for remote containers, and you'll find the commands that is relevant. And one of them is then add development container configuration files. And again, it's going to ask me what type of application are you building. So it's just going to pre-select some things that I typically want to have. So in this case, it's a .NET application. You can also see that it says like maybe you also have a SQL server. And I'll come back to that because you'll typically have some other things that needs to be run beside your application. But let's select this one now. So it's going to ask me which version. And that's just, this is .NET 6. It asks me for node. I don't have any node in this one, so I'll just select none. Now it also asks me, do you have any additional features to install? And this is actually a way to make it a lot simpler for you to install things in that Docker file without having to know too much about Docker, right? Because the thing is, this is something that all developers should be able to use, and it shouldn't really require you to learn all about Docker. So anything that you can install, really, you can install inside a Docker container, but you need to know like the proper commands and everything. And features in this dev container file is just a way to make this a lot simpler. So there is a list, and all of this is available on GitHub, and they keep adding new things. So, you know, for example, if you're building Kubernetes applications, you probably want to have like the kubectl command CLIs installed, as an example. If you're doing Java development, you probably want to have Java installed and so on. So again, this is just a lot of features that you can select to install if you want to. I'm going to skip that now. And now it says down here, it says that this folder contains a dev container configuration file. You want to reopen it and develop in a container. And this is the question that you actually will get every time. If you open a repository that has this file, VS Code will see that it has it, and it's going to ask you, do you want to reopen it and develop inside a container instead? And then you should say yes, because it's much more fun to develop in a container than on your host machine, right? So again, now we're going to have the same experience that I just showed you before on this new application that will now, build and run inside a container. So let's take a look at, actually we can run the application. So let's say yes. Let's just run it. And it's up and running. So again, nothing special, just in the default .NET web application is up and running. It figured out the port for me, which was 5024 this time. And again, the reason was that because that is, I say, exposed in the logs. But let's take a look at this file then that was added automatically. So you can see this .dev container folder. Inside we have the dev container JSON and the Docker file. So let's take a look at the dev container JSON file. So you can see the things that I showed you on the slide. We have a name for it. It should probably be something more appropriate than just C#.NET. We have a reference to the Docker file. And again, this could also be a reference to an existing Docker image that already has been built. But in this case, it will build the Docker file for you. And that Docker file can typically have some arguments. In this case, this is the way that Microsoft built their default Docker file, so you can kind of pass arguments to it and decide what you need installed. Again, you have the extensions here. So by default, you get the C# extension. And there's more things that you can look into in here. So let's actually make some changes to this one. Let's, for example, let's start by adding the post create. I think it's commented out, but actually I want to do a .NET restore. When you open this environment, it can just do a .NET restore, for example. But you can probably think of other things that needs to be run if you have things like setup scripts and so on. These could be pointed here so that everything is configured properly the first time. But then in this case, let's say that I actually want to deploy this, for example, to Azure as an Azure function. Then typically I want to have the Azure function extension installed, right? So let's add the extension to this container configuration. And to do that, I need to have the ID of that extension. So how do I get the ID? Well, it's actually pretty simple. If you use the standard extension search in VS Code, and you search for Azure function, you see it actually, or I can just mention that you have the common installed, but you can actually also install them inside the dev container, which pops up here. But in this case, I don't want to install it just for me. I want to make sure that everybody gets this extension. So I can right-click here, and there's this copy extension ID here. So if I select that one, it just makes it very simple for me to get the right ID here. All right. So, okay, so now I'm running in a container, but now I changed the dev container JSON. So how do now I want to actually apply these changes. So to do that, I can do remote containers. I can actually do a rebuild. Where are you? Sometimes it also pops up down here, no? So remote containers. It's usually on my shortlist here, but now it went away. So we have here we have the rebuild container. So let's do that. So what happens now? It's going to close the environment. It's going to rebuild my container. And it's going to reopen the environment. All the state that I had there, any changes that I made to the code, it's still there. It doesn't go away because it's actually mounted to the host in this case. So this is how you kind of do your changes when you're changing the environment configuration. So you need to test it out before you commit it. And so now I'm back to where I were. It ran the .NET Restore. You can see down here, it says I ran the .NET Restore. That was my post create command. And you can also now see that I have this Azure extension installed here. But this is now only installed inside that development environment. So if I, for example, open a new VS Code here, you can see that I don't have that Azure extension. So this is now bound to that particular development environment, which is really, really nice. And for completeness, let's take a look at the Docker file. It's not super interesting because it's just based on the Microsoft default Docker images. So in this case, it's pointing to these ones. And but here you can add anything that needs to be installed inside that development environment of yours. And the list of features that I selected, if I would have selected them, they would have been added to this Docker file. So this is a pretty simple example of just one application. It doesn't really have any dependencies. It doesn't use anything else. I'm going to show you another example, and which has it's my kind of standard demo application that I'm using, which is a quiz application, and it's kind of a two-part application. It has a web front end and it has a web API, and in this case it's using SQL Server for storing the data. So if I want to run this application, I need to run the web application, I need to run the API, and I need to run the SQL. I need to have a SQL Server running, right? And now this is more real life like, right? This is typically what you will be expecting for a proper application. You have things that needs to be set up and running and so on. And let's actually go back to this one before I show that. So because you saw that we used in this Docker file, but it also supports Docker Compose, which is just a tooling built on top of Docker. And Docker Compose is used for running, building and running multiple containers. And that's why it's just a good fit here, because now we can actually use, instead of pointing to the Docker file, we'll be pointing to the Docker Compose file. And that file will specify any kind of dependent services that I also need. For example, a SQL Server or a Redis cache, or whatever you have that you are dependent on. So we still have a Docker file for the actual development environment. So in this case, where I have a web application and the API, they will be running inside a container. But then a SQL Server container will be running next to it. And so let's let's run this one. And while we're waiting for it to run, I can show you how it actually looks in the dev container here. So the big difference now is the top one. So it doesn't point to a Docker file anymore. It actually points to my Docker Compose file. We have the service property, which says which container should I actually use as the development container. So that typically, in this case, it won't be the SQL Server, right? It will be the container where my code is actually built and run. There's other things that it says, like the shutdown action, what should happen when you close VS Code. Now I set it to stop compose, which means that everything will be teared down. This typically is not what you want for your day-to-day environment. If you just close VS Code and go to lunch, you typically don't want to restart everything when you come back. So you can just specify none here, and it will just keep running, which is typically what you would do. But for demo things, when I switch back and forth, it's nice to actually have it closed there. And if we look at the compose file that I'm pointing to, it looks like this. Oops, sorry. And let's zoom in a bit. So we're still inside this one. We're still referencing my development Docker file, because we still need an environment to actually do all coding inside. But in addition to this one, now we have this, sorry for this squealy things. We have another service that I just called DB, and here I'm pointing to the SQL Server image, the Linux SQL Server image from Microsoft, and the configuration to actually run that instance. So this means now that when I run the environment, the application, it will not just run my application, it will also spin up this SQL Server behind the scene. So I ran the application. I think it said like your application is running on port 550. So this is the application. It's up and running. And doesn't really contain any data, and it's not really relevant what the application does. But let's actually go back to here and see what's running now in terms of containers. And as you see now, we have two containers running. So the second one there is that's my development environment. Inside that one, I have the code. That's where my web and my API is running. So that's my virtual development environment. But next to it, in this case, the SQL Server is running, and that's why my applications are up and running. It downloads that image if it's not there, and it's up and running, and it just works. I just need to clone the repository, open it up, press F5, and everything is up and running. So that's really like a super nice experience, and it's so much better than coming to that incorrect README file and try to get everything to work. And again, any changes to these files will automatically be used by any other developer on the same team when they open it. So it really gives you a big advantage. Okay, so again, all of the things you can do now, like local, the code can be anywhere. It's not related to GitHub at all. But let's talk about GitHub Codespaces, because that's what's in the title of this session, right? So, but now you know that this is built on top of the things that I just showed you, like these VS Code remote extensions. So what they do, they provide everything outside of this. So spinning up the machines, giving you access, and a few other things. So when you run application in Codespace, I showed you what happened when you run it locally. Everything was running inside a container. And the same thing is applicable to Codespace. Everything will be running inside a container somewhere, on the machine somewhere. You don't know where it is, but it's somewhere. But you can actually still run the application and access it. That's a little bit of magic, perhaps, how you can actually access the application, because it's running somewhere in the cloud. But I'll show you a demo of that. And it's it works really in the same way. But of course, it can't expose localhost because you need to access it from your local computer towards the cloud. So GitHub Codespaces is pay as you go. Here you can see like the current offering in terms of the machine sizes. So again, you can have from 2 cores up to 32 cores, various amounts of RAM, and then you have the current pricing. And then you also pay a little bit for the actual storage. So depending on how much code and stuff you have inside your environment, that will cost you a little bit more. So again, of course, this is kind of interesting now. How much would you pay for an environment? Well, it depends on how much. It depends, first of all, which type of machine you're using, but also, of course, how long you're running it. And it's well documented how the machines work in terms of if you spin them up and then you don't do anything, it will go into idle mode and then it will shut down. Everything will, of course, be saved. I think the default is, like the idle timeout is 30 minutes. Everything to not cost you a lot of money. And again, you don't have to use the same machine size every time. You can kind of pick the one that actually is relevant. And you can actually add this to your dev container file. You can specify at least, you can specify like the requirements, which will, first up, it will disable you from creating a machine that is smaller than that, because in some cases, if you're running a SQL Server, for example, you can't have, you need to have a certain amount of memory, for example. But as with all cloud resources, you need to make sure that it's actually, you don't use it more than what you want to pay for. But that's always the case. So let's see what GitHub Codespaces looks like. And as you'll see, it will be very, very similar to the things that I showed you. So let's head over to GitHub here. Let's just close the other ones here. And so I'm just going to open a repository called Codespace demo. So this is actually a fork of one of the Codespace samples from GitHub. And so this is just it's a node application. And if you want, normally you would click code here, and you would get the clone information, and you would clone the code to your machine, and you would do your work and so on. But instead, if you have Codespace enabled, you have another tab here. Next to local, this says welcome to cloud editing. And then I can select create Codespace, and I can also do like this configuration here, which will actually allow me to select a few things. So first up, I can select which branch do I want to work on. And of course, it doesn't always have to be the main branch. And then we have the dev container configuration. That's the JSON file that we just talked about. And I didn't mention this, but you can actually have multiple dev container files inside the same repository, which can actually make a lot of sense, in particular if you're doing like monorepo things, where you have multiple applications in the same repo. It could actually be like one .NET application and one Java application, for example, in the same repository. So then, of course, it makes sense to have different dev container files. So if you have multiple, you will have multiple items in that list that you can select. And then you can select the region. You can see the 4 regions that is available right now. And then you can select the machine type, which unfortunately I have this personal account, so I can't select the machine size here. It's pre-configured to this 4-core. But if you have GitHub Teams and Enterprise, you will be able to select from that list that I showed you, from 2 cores up to 32 cores. So either way, let's just create one and see what happens. So now, really the same thing that I showed you before on my machine happens, but somewhere in the cloud. And you can actually see you get a little web console here, where you can actually see what's happening. And boom, the environment is up and running now. And the application is now being cloned to that container on that machine somewhere in Azure. You don't really know where, and you don't really care. And now I'm running VS Code in the browser, and a few of you have probably used that before. And it's actually a very similar experience. Everything that you can do pretty much in VS Code locally, you can do here. So you can edit your code, you have all the extensions here, you can build it, you can check it in, everything. So it's like really low barrier to start working here. Just click that button and you're up and running. You have everything here. So this is a node application, and let's actually run it. So I'll do an npm start. And start up really fast. Again, it says down here, your application running on port 3000 is available. You want to see all forwarded ports, so I can actually go here to the ports tab again and see that it's exposed my 3000 port. But in this case, of course, I can't access it using like the local host 3000 that I used before. But let's click this one and see what happens. So as you'll see now, I'm actually accessing the application that is now running inside a container somewhere. And you can see the URL here, which is a little bit kind of generated for you. So it typically looks like this. You have the org account, you have the name of the repo, you have some weird GUID, and kind of the port is also part of the URL. And then you have the .github preview.dev. So now I'm actually accessing my application running inside that one. And this is an authenticated URL by default, by the way. So it's not like someone can access it. So if I just copy this one, open an incognito browser, you'll see that I have to be authenticated to actually access my application. I can actually change that if I want to. If you want to kind of share it temporarily, for example, I can actually go into this port mapping here, and I can select the port visibility and change this to public. So let's do that. And let's go back. Well, we can do this one. And then I'm going straight to the application. So you can by default, it's going to be private, but you can actually make it public if you want to. So, of course, this was kind of super simple, right? Just click the button, everything is up and running. If I want to, I can open this up in VS Code. So I can select open in VS Code. If for some reason you don't want to work in that browser, you want to have that safe and cuddly feel of actually using the IDE locally, you can do that. And it's going to open up, and just, again, you're working on your machine, but everything that's really going on is going on in that container somewhere. And in the Remote Explorer that gets installed with that extension, there's actually like two modes here. You can either, when you're working locally, you have the containers, but when you're working remote in Codespace, you can select GitHub Codespaces here. And then I get kind of information about that Codespace that I'm currently connected to, like the name, the branch, the type of machine, how long, the idle timeout, as I mentioned before, 30 minutes, and so on. So, but again, if I wanted, for example, let's add, let's check on the dev container and see what it's like to actually work in here. Let's see what type of change can we make. So actually, we can add that extension again, just to kind of. Do I still have it here? Nope, I don't. Let's search for it again. Azure function. Let's copy it. Go back. Oh, actually, maybe in VS Code now. Actually, I wanted to be in the browser. They're so similar, so you can't really tell the difference if you're where you are. So let's go back here, because I kind of want to do it here just to kind of show you what it's like to work in the browser. So, all right, we don't have the container for it. So let's add this one. So this repo doesn't actually have a dev container. So again, by default, you just open up any repository. It's going to use the default container image. But now I actually want to do some customization. So I select the node in this case, because it's a node application. So I get my dev container. Let's make some changes to it. For example, that extension. And maybe also want to do an npm install to make sure that when you open it, it's actually going to be able to run properly. Okay, so we made some changes. You can see that I have like 3 pending changes here. Again, now it actually popped up here and says that, that wasn't actually that one, but we got another pop-up that says we noticed a change to the dev container configuration. You want to rebuild the container and apply them now. And of course, that's part of that flow. You want to test those changes before you commit them. So I can just click that one, and now the container will be rebuilt using my new configuration. All the state is still there. Nothing is being lost, of course. I still have 3 pending changes. If you feel scared by it, you can commit it first, of course, but you don't have to. You can actually also see like the logs when this thing happens, at least if it takes a while. You can see it like Docker things and everything that happens behind the scene by looking at the logs. And we should be up and running now. There we go. And so, just to verify that actually it works, we should, like in a second, yep, there we go. We can see the little Azure icon down there. So I know that this new environment is actually working properly. So what's really nice now is that, if you want to make changes here, let's commit this. Added dev container. Let's commit it. Let's, sorry. Oh, so actually I wanted to create a new branch here. Let's create a new branch. Let's call it feature add dev container NDC, in case I already used that branch. Let's publish it. And it says, okay, you publish it. You want to create a pull request. So create pull request. So the GitHub pull request extension is all by default enabled here. So you get this in-browser pull request extension, which is actually really nice. So it's really about staying in the focus. You don't have to go anywhere else. You can actually create the pull request right from where I am, right from the IDE, really. It's the same if you use the VS Code on your local machine. So I can just create the pull request, and it's going to open up inside here, and I can continue the discussion here, and eventually I can merge that pull request. So as you can see, it's like a really swift and super simple way of working without spending any time really setting up your environment. And hopefully you can see like the benefits that this will give to you. Like if you just want to make a quick fix, you don't have to spend all the time setting everything up. You can just add the code. So for example, if you have a PR, I think I have a PR on this one. Maybe someone sends me a PR that he wants me to take a look at. So let's open that one. Again, I can, from the code here, I can see that there's a code space available here, so I can actually just create a code space for it. That particular branch will be cloned, and I can work on that pull request, make some changes to it without spending any additional time on that. So I think that's a super nice experience. So just a few things at the end. One thing that is it's in beta, and I think it's going to be like super cool to use, is what's called a pre-build code spaces. And this is something that actually GitHub built because they had to use it for their own sake. And I'm just going to go 2 slides forward because it's. So I have a link here to a blog post from GitHub where they are discussing like how they are using GitHub Codespaces to develop GitHub. So they have moved from their old way of working with GitHub to actually use Codespaces. And on that journey, they had to make some changes because, as you can read in this blog post, in the beginning it took 45 minutes to get up and running, even when they were using Codespaces, because first up it took 20 minutes for them to clone the repository, because it's a huge repository. And once that is cloned, they still need to run various setup scripts, which takes another 20 minutes. So they will say, okay, this is nice, it's working, but it's too slow. We have to move faster. So in that blog post, they describe how they went from 45 minutes to 10 minutes, and then down to 5 seconds. And that last hop from 10 minutes to 5 seconds is really what this is about. So this is a way that you will be able to configure like pre-builds. And so what will happen here is that every time you commit something into a branch that you have configured for pre-builds, that will actually kick off the creation of a code space. And that means that when I go here and I want to start making adding some kind of feature, there is already an existing code space that is up and running for me. So I can just click that one, and boom, everything is already set up. So the code space is created, any setup scripts is created, so I'm actually up and running in like just a few seconds. And that really, I think, have kind of revolutionized the way that they are developing GitHub.com. So I think in particular, if you have large systems, it takes quite some time to not just clone, but also to build and maybe to run setup scripts. This is going to be like super interesting for you to use. So you'll be able to see like this. There's actually pre-builds ready. And you can also, behind the scene, it's GitHub Actions, workflows that does this for you. And you can configure how this builds and when these builds will be done. Like, should you do this on every push, or should you do it on schedule, or there's various options here. So this is still in beta, so it's not like for GA yet, but I think that will be fairly soon. So take a note on that link, or you can just search for it, and you'll probably find it. I think it's a very interesting post. And I'm actually done, and that's good because I know there's another session coming in 5 minutes. So if you have any questions, please come up to me afterwards, because I want to make room for the next speaker. So hopefully the session was valuable for you. Please fill out or just do your evaluation on the way out, and have a great conference, rest of it. Thank you.